ravers, it'll be all the ravers. Mega Ran signing off here with Super Dave. Hey, on the love.
Right. He never really had much of a career after that, and he just couldn't quite fill the cape. I was going to say the shoes, but he couldn't fill out the cape. Although when he could do something physical, he was great. But he was with all those British actors, and they could handle language, wonderfully, and he was kind of lost. So it ran for a while in London. But boy, it was a thrill to go over and find your name on the marquee.
Oh, I bet. Oh, wow. So have you seen the new Mummy with Tom Cruise, and what do you think about Universal rebooting their whole monster works, and I think they're calling it Dark Universe. What do you think about that?
I think they desperately need to hire me to bail them out after that Mummy movie, and I can Universal. I can fix it for you. I guarantee you, I can make that work.
Yeah, definitely. Bob Hall, Universal. You need to get him because. That movie was a little bit of a disaster.
I'll hold up my card at the end.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm sure the Universal Studios are just watching for you're waiting for me. I know you are.
Yeah, well, you never know. So, tell us about your directing chops in the new Rude Mechanicals.
The new Rude Mechanicals. The name is from the Midsummer Night's Dream. The workmen who all get together and do a play and do it really badly, and it's very funny, are called the Rude Mechanicals. And so we were the new Rude Mechanicals because it was a little theater we started for no money off Broadway. And I had been directing all over the place, alternating doing Marvel with directing plays at Cornell University, various regional theaters, University of Virginia, and having a halfway reasonable career. But I wanted to do stuff in New York, and we started a little company that worked off Broadway, and that's really the whole story. Off is where you do what you want, but you get no money for it. And it was as much fun as I've ever had doing theater. After that, I became the artistic director. The University of Nebraska asked me to come back and be artistic director of their summer program, which was a professional summer program, and did that for quite a while. And then Valiant came into being, and Jim Shooter asked me to come and write and draw for Valiant. And that changed my whole career for a while, because being able to write and draw was just such a treat.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, absolutely. So let me ask you, you've been a cartoonist, you've been a writer, an editor for Marvel, you mentioned Valiant and DC Comics, but what people might not know is you took these gigs to sustain yourself during the periods of theatrical unemployment in New York. Was theater your first love?
I was addicted to doing theater, and I always used to say that the nice thing about doing comic books is that the actors always knew their lines and they always stood where you put them. But I really alternated between both. If I'm doing a theater bio, I kind of stress the theater. If I'm doing a comics bio, I stress the comics. I had thought, once I did Valiant, I said, this puts it all together. Being able to write it myself is a whole thing, another thing. I did that. Then I created something called Armed and Dangerous for Valiant.
Right.
It was Valiant / Acclaim by that time.
Right.
And I really wanted to pursue that career, and then that cataclysm hit comics in the around the year 2000, when the the collector's market just burst.
Yeah, it just went.
It was a balloon.
Bottom came out.
We all knew it was a balloon, but what we hadn't realized is how many of the actual readers had gone away during that time. And as people probably know, comics have never really solved that problem. Comics are much more of a niche market now than they used to be, and they've done a correction for that reason. People think that the comics industry must be burgeoning because of the movies, but it's burgeoning laterally. There are a lot more and a lot more interesting things happening, a lot of independent stuff. But the reason Marvel puts out so many different comics of like if they're doing primarily an Avengers year, they'll put out 1 million Avengers comics, is that they have to make their sales laterally. Nothing ever sells that many comics anymore as it used to. And there were a lot of just big differences. The comic book store, which saved the industry back in the 70s when comics were being forced off the newsstands because there had become a plethora of new magazines, and comic books were the low-rent guy on the stand at that point. And the comic book store, the idea of distributing basically to head shops at the time, which then evolved into comic book stores, really saved the industry. It never occurred to us that a couple of generations later, there were going to be kids, and this happened during that collector's boom, who would never have seen a comic book. And so we would all go around saying, well, once this balloon is done, we'll still have the kids market, but the comics weren't in grocery stores anymore, and they weren't in drugstores anymore. And what's more, unlike when I was growing up, if you went and parked your kids at a comic book stand while you went and shopped in the supermarket, in the 90s, you would have been arrested.
Yeah, that's true.
It is.
Right.
And so it was a very different era, whereas comic book shops, if you wanted a comic book, you have to know you want a comic book before you go to that comic book shop. And for a kid, if they're not seeing the comic books, it's a whole different ball of wax. Either your dad is a fan and has to say, come on, I want to show you a comic book shop, or you're probably never going to go in. So it's been a much harder sell after that. And the comic book companies just basically, Marvel went bankrupt, as I'm sure all of you out there know, and DC didn't, only because they're owned by Time Warner.
Yeah, they've got a big
and
Marvel
deep
has
pockets
big money
now.
Pockets now with Disney.
But
and
so basically they fired everybody. There is. At Marvel, there are no editors now that I was working with when I worked for Marvel. At DC, there's a couple, like people like Mike Carlin are still there, but most of DC is a different group of people. So, Acclaim slowly went out of business, mainly because instead of developing the storylines that had been worked for Valiant, they wanted, as they put it to us, we want you to develop icons for our games, and they were really interested in games. So the company could not hold up to that, and the decline in readership with the Cataclysm. And I got a little bit of work from Denny O'Neil at DC Comics, writing and drawing some Batman stuff. Great fun. Then Denny retired, and then I stopped working for the big two. The phone has not been ringing, and that's been true for a lot of comic book artists who worked there in the
beginning.
in the 70s, 80s, 90s.
Right.
Most of us aren't working in the business anymore in the same way. So that's just the truth of it. So I ended up starting a Shakespeare festival.
Cool.
In my hometown. And that's what I've been doing the last 15 years.
Right. Awesome. Awesome. Well, I'm going to ask you just one more question. How was it working with Stan Lee? Did you get a chance to work with Stan Lee?
I did not get a chance to work with Stan Lee. I got to work for Stan Lee.
Right.
But when I got into the business, Stan was already becoming more and more located in Hollywood.
Yes.
And he was undertaking to convince them of what eventually he managed to do, which was, if you just do these and do them the way we wrote them, they'll work.
Yeah.
And I am really happy that Stan lived to see that happen. He worked his butt off to make that happen, and he still was around Marvel. You still did an interview with Stan, and he still would stand on his desk and talk about how the dynamic Marvel comics ought to be,
Right.
And it was a big thrill. He also, at that point, I was very puzzled. He was also wandering through the halls with a blood-stained napkin on his head, and I couldn't figure out what is going on. And somebody said, he's getting his hair transplant. So,
Right.
so I had a strange impression of Stan, but Stan is great. I've always thought Stan was just brilliant. I almost got to work with him on the Captain America movie comic, which I agreed to do because Stan was going to write it. And then the problem was, I think Stan read the movie script. And this is the old Captain America movie, the one back in the late 80s.
Yes.
And Stan said, I can't do it. I can't write that. And so they had me adapt it.
Right.
And Stan did write the dialogue for it. But of course, given that way of working, we never actually worked together, which is too bad. But he did agree to be on the board of directors for the New Rude Mechanicals.
Oh, cool.
And at that time he was permanently in California, and Stan
Right.
said, I'm willing to do it, but I'm never going to be able to come to a board meeting. And I said, Stan, just to be able to put on the letterhead that I got Stan Lee in my board of directors, that's just fine. So I had Stan Lee and Jim Shooter on my board of directors, and that was kind of a thrill too.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Bob, thank you so much for coming on Super Dave Raines and the Big Show at Kapow Comics and Coffee. It's been a pleasure to talk to a legend. Wow, you've had an amazing career. We feel so fortunate to be able to talk to you today. So, ladies and gentlemen, Bob Hall, legendary artist, writer, director, Mr. Everything, right here on Super Dave Raines and the Big Show.
Keep talking about it. Just say those things. Say more of those things, Super Dave.
Oh, yes, sir. So,
See, nobody calls me Super Bob.
Super Bob Hall with Super Dave Raines. So, thank you so much. And until next time, on the love.